And we're back for another episode of Standpoint. Today we have a very special guest with us, Ambassador John Bolton. Ambassador Bolton's distinguished career spans decades of service at the highest levels of government, including as U.S. National Security Advisor and Ambassador to the United Nations. He also served as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. In the last few years, the focus really has been on local government in the United States. People are obsessed with how our local government affects our lives, the governors, mayors, etc. during and after COVID. Of course, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, everyone suddenly focused on how the local government affects us. But now, in the last year, with the world on fire, with wars waging in Russia and Ukraine, a civil war in Sudan, and of course the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, now foreign policy is at the tip of everybody's tongue. But like we were talking a little bit before we got on the air when we started streaming, foreign policy is a lot more complex than people realize, and now we live in a society where everybody wants to learn everything through TikTok or through X, but foreign policy is not something that you can learn just by swiping your thumb, which is why we decided to invite Ambassador Bolton to join us today to unpack the craziness that's happening around the world and how that impacts us here in the United States. Ambassador Bolton, thank you so much.
Well, very glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Ambassador, everything seems backwards in the world today, and we have institutions and powers that be suddenly openly standing for and with terroristic regimes and against freedom and democracy. Case in point, the United Nations, like you saw this week, held a moment of silence, hung their flag at half staff in memory of the president of Iran, the butcher of Iran, President Raisi, who died in a helicopter crash. Our own State Department put out a press release offering condolences. What's going on in this world, and how has the world lost its moral compass so quickly?
Well, I'm not sure the UN ever had much of a moral compass, but it's certainly true for the State Department that the Biden administration, following the example of the Obama administration, has just been obsessed with the idea that if they could reach deals with the Ayatollahs in Iran, that sweetness and light would break out in the Middle East, and that's simply not true. It is not the American custom to express condolences when a head of government or head of state dies in any country around the world. We don't do that. There are plenty of countries that we don't say anything at all about. And I think it also bears underlining that the president of Iran is not the head of the government there. Really, it's the supreme leader, currently the Ayatollah Khatami, and people just need to think about that term. Supreme leader, it has a certain ring to it, and Raisi was his subordinate, and that was very clear. So I don't even think it was warranted at the UN, but it shows, I think, how the U.S. and Israel and people who think like we do are still losing the propaganda war around the world of explaining to people what a threat Iran is, not just at the nuclear level, but at the level of its support for international terrorism, which it has itself been practicing since the 1979 revolution.
Yeah, what's interesting, Ambassador, is today in the Wall Street Journal, they were speaking about how President Raisi was being looked at and considered as a successor for the Ayatollah. So that this really was a potentially destabilizing moment for Iran. You spoke about on the news yesterday that you wouldn't be surprised, I think, if you saw Iran lashing out after this. How do you see Raisi's death, whether it was caused by a foreign power, the U.S., Israel, or someone else, or not? How do you see that affecting and impacting the way Iran is dealing with the world?
Well, I think it's interesting that the government of Iran, as of the time we speak, has not yet made an official statement what it thinks the cause of the crash was. There are a lot of reasons to think it could be the weather, pilot error, mechanical malfunction. You can't rule those out yet, but you also can't rule out internal dissension or some external intelligence service. And so the government of Iran's silence, I think, is noteworthy. When they do announce who they think is responsible, I think that could be important. In the very short term, while they're preoccupied with dealing with the gap in their leadership structure caused by Raisi's death, I think in terms of days or maybe weeks, I don't expect much change. It's on autopilot. But if in fact this unexpected death of Raisi does lead to in effect, a premature succession crisis, the decision about who will follow the Ayatollah Khamenei, then I think if there's instability in Iran, in the authoritarian playbook, whenever you have a domestic problem, you try and divert your people's attention by pointing to some external threat. So I think it's entirely possible that Iran would dial up Hezbollah in its attacks on Israel, dial up the Houthis in Yemen for their efforts to close the Red Sea and the Suez Canal to international traffic, or the Shia militia in Iraq and Syria. So I think it really is a very dangerous and uncertain time in the region as a whole. Everybody's focused on the war in Gaza, but I think this helps underline that what Israel is facing, and the United States as well, is not an Arab-Israeli war in Gaza, or even a Palestinian-Israeli war. This is an Iranian war against Israel that's being fought on multiple different fronts. So the potential instability caused by Raisi's death has real potential for implication outside Iran's borders.
Ambassador, I don't know if you saw Senator Ted Cruz's cross-examination of Secretary of State Blinken this week, where they were going back and forth about the United States' failure to enforce sanctions on Iran. I think the facts seem to be clear that Biden has not been enforcing the sanctions. I think there were 2 waivers signed since October 7th, if I'm not mistaken, to allow Iran to continue to sell their oil around the world. Except the Biden administration, Blinken included, during that cross-examination, seemed to be living or presenting an alternative reality, saying, no, we are trying to enforce the sanctions. There's hundreds of sanctions in place, and they're just doing a great job getting around the sanctions. What do you have to add to that conversation?
Well, he might be right in part that the Iranians are succeeding in getting around the sanctions, and that's been true for longer even than the Biden administration. The best day a sanction has is the day it's announced, if you don't enforce it. Otherwise, it's just a piece of paper. And you can have hundreds of sanctions, as we do against Iran, but they're not comprehensive. In the Trump administration, we said we were applying a maximum pressure approach. But really, we could have done more. We could have done a lot more. We should have done a lot more, because I think the real objective here, from the U.S. perspective, should be the overthrow of the regime. We're not going to have any chance for peace and stability in the Middle East while this terrorist regime stays in power. But certainly, you could have much tighter enforcement of the sanctions on what for Iran is its most important commodity, the export of oil and gas. And international statistics that are out there say that Iran today is selling on the international market quantities of oil and gas equivalent to what they were selling before the Trump administration withdrew from the nuclear deal and reimposed the sanctions, which means, in effect, the sanctions that were imposed again in 2018 no longer are having any effect. There are earlier sanctions that had been imposed on Iran, and I mean earlier, like 20 years ago, not for the nuclear program, but for Iran's support of international terrorism. And those have always remained in effect, but they're not being enforced either. So the Iranians obviously don't feel pressure. That's why their ring of fire strategy against Israel is on full display now. If they were really under economic pressure, they would not have allowed Hamas to undertake the October 7 attack. The Iranians didn't arm and equip and train and finance all these terrorist surrogates for the benefit of the surrogates. They did it for the benefit of Iran. And we're seeing now that the government in Tehran did not feel pressed, did not feel constrained, and felt that it could try out this ring of fire strategy to see how it worked.
Help us understand the connection between Iran and the war that's happening in Russia, Ukraine. We know that reports are at least that I think 80% of the oil and gas that they export goes to Russia. But what other connections do we see between Iran and Russia?
Well, there are a lot of them, and they're growing. And I think to understand particularly why this affects the U.S. as well as Israel and our other friends in the Middle East, is that Iran sells already enormous quantities of oil and gas to China. Now it's engaged in more commerce with Russia, including selling them drones, which they're using against Ukraine in the war there. And I think what's happening is that Iran is becoming, in effect, a satellite of a new Beijing-Moscow axis. Reminds us of the Sino-Soviet alliance during the Cold War, except obviously this time Beijing is in the driver's seat and Russia's the subordinate partner. But Iran, North Korea, Syria, Belarus, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela in this hemisphere are really all kind of part of this emerging axis. And the ties between Russia and Iran have been growing closer. In the case of Venezuela, for example, we know that Iran has enormous interest in Venezuela's reserves of uranium, probably the second largest reserves other than Canada in the Western Hemisphere. We know that Iran, with Russian cooperation, has been providing Venezuela with what they call diluents, which are used to take the very heavy crude that Venezuela produces and make it something more amenable to refiners who refine light crude. So these connections are growing, and these are just the ways we know the connections are growing, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if they're growing in many ways we haven't detected yet.
So why is it, do you think, that the United States, at least under this administration, seems to be blind to it? In the sense, for example, if you look at Latin America, Brazil, where this president has supported President Lula there, who's rabidly anti-American and is aligned with Russia, Iran, and China, right, with the BRICS, et cetera, and different agreements, formal and informal as well. While on the other hand, you have the president of Milei in Argentina, who is pro-America, pro-capitalist, of course, pro-Israel. That's always the other side of the ledger when you're looking at global issues like this. But the U.S. seems to be, I feel like they're blind to this, or they're willfully ignoring it. I'm trying to understand is there any logic behind it? What do you think they're trying to push? Which kind of policy are they trying to push for America?
Well, I think for again, the Biden administration, which looks a lot like the Obama administration, they are really obsessed with Iran, and they think that that's the key to long-term stability in the Middle East. And in a sense, given Iran's size, the potential size of its economy, that's true at some level. But it's certainly not true when the country's ruled by the Ayatollahs and the Islamic Revolution. Some people said beginning in 1979, look, they'll cool off, they'll be less radical, they'll moderate, everything will work out fine. Well, that hasn't happened. And in fact, there are lots of new reporting that the next generation of Ayatollahs are even more radical than the Ayatollah Khamenei. So this is there's no sign this regime is going to moderate, which is why ultimately I think regime change is the only answer. But that is 180 degrees away from the view of the Biden people, as it was with the Obama people. And, one of the reasons that we've seen the Saudis and other Gulf Arab countries become more distant from the United States, and yet growing closer to Israel, is that they recognize that the Gulf Arab states and Israel have a more closely aligned strategic view of the Iranian threat than the Arab states do with the United States, at least under the Biden administration. It is just not realistic to think that we can get any deal with Iran, whether it's on the nuclear program or any other threat to us, that the Iranian government currently will abide by. And it's the ongoing threat you can see every day in their ballistic missile efforts, in their nuclear weapons program, and in their support for terrorism. They're after our allies, and they're after us too, including people here in the United States that they're trying to assassinate. So this is not a regime that you can find stability with. It's almost as though it's inherent in terrorist and authoritarian governments. They don't honor the commitments they make by and large. And in the case of the Iranian government, the deals they make simply indicate a new process of bargaining about what they just agreed to.
Yeah, and as you said, the heart of all this is China and Beijing, and the United States seems, if we look at it honestly and objectively, it's a complicated situation, because if we want to just cut Beijing off and cut off China entirely, I think that would be devastating to our economy, because we rely on them so much. So in Republican circles, we talk about strategic decoupling, et cetera, like start taking steps away from China, while China's stockpiling minerals and stockpiling grains and making economic alliances with our enemies like Russia and Iran. But what steps do you think the United States needs to take to actually deal with the growing threat of China?
Well, one thing to consider is that the Chinese threat is really across the entire society. It's not just a military threat. It's not just an economic threat. It's a social threat as well. And to remember that they are still a Marxist country. It's hard to penetrate, 3 and 4 hour long speeches by Xi Jinping to see it. It's not like communism of the 1950s, but their logic remains Marxist. And so understanding what they're saying takes some patience and diligence. And they're also very good at showing the West what they want to. The reforms that Deng Xiaoping put in the mid 1980s, moving towards a more market-oriented economic policy, produced economic growth in China, enormous economic growth, which is what you'd expect when you move away from Marxist economic principles. But Deng Xiaoping said at the time, one of his principles was what they call hide and bide. Hide your capabilities and bide your time. In other words, to get China to the point where it really could confront the West, which I think they now believe they're at. So we see a huge military buildup from China, including all across the spectrum: increased nuclear weapons, increased ballistic missiles, huge programs in cyberspace, programs in space itself, anti-satellite capabilities, and putting pressure all along their periphery. So from the U.S. perspective, in response, we need significant increases in our defense budget. We need it not just for China, but for a number of other reasons. And the bad news for politicians, if you also believe, as I do, that we need to cut our annual budget deficit and get the national debt down, that means if you're going to increase defense spending, you have to cut domestic spending even more. Domestic spending is not going to protect us from our adversaries. But we've also got to worry about China economically. They've been stealing our intellectual property for 30 or 40 years. That's one reason why they can sometimes outcompete us. They don't have to do research and development costs if they can steal our technology. They've abused the international trade system, and we have not defended ourselves adequately. So with our allies, I think we've got to be much clearer to the Chinese. We're not going to accept that kind of economic behavior, nor are we going to accept what they're trying to do to us in telecommunications, for example, through companies like Huawei and ZTE, trying to take control of fifth generation telecommunications, through TikTok to help influence the people who use TikTok, but also to harvest the data the users provide when they use that system. That all goes back to China and gets fed into this enormous database about America and other Western countries that China is preparing. We need politicians in this country who are willing to talk about the threat from China and how to deal with it, considering, as you said rightly at the beginning, how much economic dependence we've allowed ourselves to develop on China. This is not an easy solution. I do think we've turned a corner. I think more and more people understand the nature of the Chinese threat, but in terms of actively dealing with it, I think we still have a long way to go.
I don't know if you read this book, 100-Year Marathon, by I think it's Michael Pillsbury.
Right.
So it was recommended to me to understand the threat of China. First of all, I recommend that book. It's incredibly interesting, and it seems like a conspiracy theory, but it's not, and it's very well sourced and written as sort of how China is planning to take over the world, which is actually a good segue, and you mentioned it as well. Sort of in the as you know, in the GOP, there's a growing strand. It's still a small minority, but the rumblings are there on isolationism. Our debt is through the roof, so why should we spend any money outside of our borders? Let's take care of ourselves here at home. From a simple perspective, or a simpleton's perspective, even it could make some sense, but that's not the world we live in. The impacts of what happens beyond our border will impact us here every single day. 9/11 is the greatest example of that, unfortunately. But can you help put a pin on it a little bit to understand how the wars that we're seeing around the world, whether it's Hamas against Israel, Iran, China, Russia, Ukraine, how does that impact us here in the United States?
Yeah, I think we've got another failure of America's political leaders to deal with here. And I think the failure starts really with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union. The countries of Central and Eastern Europe were freed from the Warsaw Pact, freed from Soviet domination. The Soviet Union itself collapsed, and we had real optimism in the early 1990s that democracy would spread all through territory that had been communist for a long, long time. People said it was the end of history. People said it now globalization will take care of everything. Economies will flourish. We don't have any more foreign threats to worry about. And in the U.S. and in Western Europe, defense budgets were cut dramatically, and we're still feeling the consequences of that. Today, we live in a world of rising threats all around, in China, in East Asia, in the South China Sea, along its land borders with Vietnam and India. Obviously, Russia invading Ukraine, but putting all the independent states that were formerly part of the Soviet Union at risk. Iran and these terrorist groups in the Middle East that threaten Israel, the Gulf Arab states, and the U.S. In this hemisphere, what I call the troika of tyranny. When I was in the White House, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba all remain very serious threats, backed now again by these large powers. And the question is how you protect the American way of life, how you protect our economy here at home. And the notion that you can simply hide behind the two oceans disappeared a long time ago. Those oceans can be traversed by ballistic missiles in a few minutes, or enemy submarines can come up on our coast right next to major cities like New York or Miami and threaten them immediately. The best way to defend American interests, because we are tied up economically all around the world, we've got friends and allies all around the world, is a forward defense. It's better to be working on threats before they materialize close to the United States or become more serious. This is something that we've learned over a period of time, but some people forget, and they forget a lot more. They forget a lot about American history. They say we kept away from all these foreign conflicts. We just stayed at home. I guess maybe they think we stayed at home knitting for a couple centuries until we became a great power. The fact is, the U.S. prudently stayed away from wars in Europe while it was still a young and growing country. But the fact is, we were growing. We moved from 13 colonies strung out along the coast of the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific. Then we kept going, asked the people in Hawaii and Alaska how they like being part of the United States as opposed to something else. We developed economic ties all around the world, and we've been involved in the world economy from the beginning. The first American ship to trade with China was called the Empress of China, commissioned in 1783, the year of the Versailles Treaty. That was when our first contact with China began. We have always been an outward-looking trading nation, and we've been a great success. We were able to avoid wars for a while, but even in the 19th century, we were growing out. Our defenses were moving from continental defenses to global defenses, and we are a global power now. Our interests are everywhere, and to protect those interests, we need the capability, as Ronald Reagan used to say, to preserve the peace through American strength. And I do think, as I say, American political leaders have not made the case enough, which is why the isolationist theory seems attractive to some people. I think the case can be made about what American national interests are, and I think we ought to ask our political leaders to make it.
Yeah, absolutely. When we see the lack of American leadership, I think, and influence around the world and the global stage, the most recent example of that is this week in the ICC, the International Criminal Court. The prosecutor, as you know, is requesting arrest warrants, not just for Sinwar, but against Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. You've spoken a lot about it. And why I say, from my perspective, it's an indication of American weakness, is that America hasn't had the ability to dissuade the ICC, if they wanted to even have that ability, from doing so. We know a couple years ago when you were in the White House, the ICC was threatening to do the same against Americans. And President Trump, I know you were involved in that, issued an executive order sanctioning anyone in the ICC involved in the prosecution of Americans. And that convinced them not only to stop the investigation, but the prosecutor stepped down. And he who replaced him now, Khan, is the one who's moving forward with this. In the U.S., we have Congress now barking, saying that they're going to make a big statement. They're going to pass sanctions, which is fantastic. But I don't see American leadership being strong enough to have dissuaded them from doing so. What do you think?
No, I think that's right. Look, I've been arguing against the ICC for 25 years. It's a fundamentally illegitimate institution. It's a fake court. And many of the people who advocated creating the ICC back in the 1990s did it expressly because they thought it would be a way to constrain American power. So I've always and negotiated and signed by the Clinton administration. I've always said that my proudest day in the government was the day on behalf of the George W. Bush administration. I unsigned the treaty that created the International Criminal Court. Fundamentally, it's an infringement on American sovereignty. We can govern ourselves. Thank you very much. We're people who believe in following the rules of armed combat or whatever rules we set up. We have our own judges. Frankly, we'll judge our own people if they commit misdeeds. We don't need some international court that isn't any better at assessing these things than we are, telling us what to do. And I think it'll be a cold day in hell before the United States ever joins this court. But we've got it. We can protect ourselves, and we will. But when we have allies like Israel, a rule of law, democratic society that some unaccountable, unelected prosecutor who doesn't have any accountability for his actions in the middle of an ongoing conflict tries to get arrest warrants issued, that's something that we should take steps against. And I think definitely that should include sanctions against the court. We've got to tell people this is not something that we will accept when they go after people we consider the bad guys. They also want arrest warrants against Hamas. That's great, but it doesn't make that court any more legitimate. And you can't, it would be hypocritical to say, well, it's great when you prosecute people we don't like, but not good when you prosecute people we like. The court itself is unfixable and unworthy of American support. And that's what Joe Biden needed to say. Obviously, he didn't. And we'll pay the consequences down the road for that.
Yeah, to be clear, the ICC has never prosecuted a sitting head of state ever. We know that these arrest warrants, if issued, are just pieces of paper, and they just have to be enforced by their countries. But unfortunately, given the growing anti-Israel and anti-Semitism around the world, if any country is going to enforce them against a sitting head of state, it would be against an arrest warrant against Israel, or the prime minister of Israel, even though the substance is absolutely nonsense. First of all, it is a hidden document. They haven't released the arrest warrant request document. That's a private process. Even the hearing with the judges is a private process. But what we know from the press conferences that this self-important prosecutor has been holding, the substance of it is nonsense. And also jurisdictionally, it makes no sense. We're going to do a full episode on the ICC soon so people can understand it. But just in short, Israel is not a member of the ICC, just like the United States is not. But they say that because the quote-unquote state of Palestine, which doesn't exist, it's a figment of imagination, but because that was recognized by the ICC and these alleged crimes happened in a state that was recognized by the ICC, that's one element of jurisdiction that they say they meet. And the second one is, of course, it can't be, the jurisdiction only applies where the host country where these alleged crimes take place if they don't have a valid court system, a proper court system that could prosecute crimes, which Israel obviously does. Have a very robust left-wing, progressive, liberal court system that's been the topic of debate for the last 3 years for anyone who's been paying attention. But like you said so well, no one's checking. There's no checks and balances. So whatever this prosecutor says and these three judges say in their private hearing, that's what's going to go. So, I think from my perspective, we just need stronger American leadership to help right the ship here, there, and around the world.
Yeah. Look, the silver lining in this is that by undertaking to get these arrest warrants, the ICC in the U.S. is digging its own grave. And I think this will help convince people what a threat it is ultimately to us, what a threat it is right now to Israel. And, it's tough when the Democratic president condemns the ICC. There's only one American politician I'm aware of who has said it was the right thing to do to go after the Israeli officials, and that's Bernie Sanders, which tells you a lot about the nature of
Absolutely.
the ICC support.
Yeah. So we'll end on that note. Ambassador Bolton, I could talk to you for hours and hours. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for everything you're doing and adding your voice to this important time.
Well, many thanks for having me. Good luck to you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks for listening. Make sure to share and follow and do all the great things to support podcasts like ours. Have a great day. Thanks, Ambassador.